Hi, I'm Suzanne Delgizzo. I'm the Center Chair for Integrated Humanities, and this is Women's History Month. So today I asked Dr. Lorraine Coons, who is a professor of history and also the co-chair of the Women's Studies program at Chestnut Hill College, to come and speak to us a little bit about the long and complex history of women's path to the right to vote. So welcome, Lorraine.
Very nice to be here.
Great. Nice to have you. So when we talk about suffrage, what do we mean? What is suffrage?
Very simply put, suffrage is that sacred right of every man and woman to exercise their right to vote in this country.
Oh, okay, good. So what was the history then around women and the right to vote, particularly in the 19th century, because it became kind of a hot issue then, right?
Yeah, but first we can speak about women's suffrage in a vacuum. I think that's important to note. It had roots in the abolitionist movement in the 1830s and 1840s. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott met when they were attending the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, but they were not recognized as quote unquote legitimate delegates by the male members, and they were forced to sit in the visitors gallery. And so they were outraged by their exclusion, and they decided that they really needed to talk about women's rights back home. Stanton organized a convention, a women's rights convention that took place in July of 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And she drafted a declaration of sentiments for that convention that basically stated that all men and women are created equal. And then she snuck in, felt was way too radical, way too controversial, because you have to see that there was a set of assumptions about women's proper place at the time that did not extend to the ballot box. So the conference was deemed nothing short of an insurrection by the press, and the women were dismissed as a congregation of Amazons. The Seneca Falls Convention marked the beginning of a 72-year struggle for women's suffrage. Now, you notice I didn't say anything about Susan B. Anthony, who is the one we all think of when we talk about suffrage. And that's because she wasn't there. She didn't join the movement until later. And she and Stanton became fast friends, and they formed together the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1872, Anthony did an unspeakable thing. She went to the polls and she voted in presidential elections because she maintained that the newly ratified 15th Amendment prohibiting the federal government from denying a citizen the right to vote based on the citizen's race, color, or prior condition of servitude, that applied to women as well. So she went out and cast her ballot and of course was arrested for that. We would say, of course, that's the way it was. She was brought to before a federal judge, and she was brought before the federal judge for the crime of voting. His mind was made up way before the trial even began. He basically told the all-male jury that they had to return a vote of guilty. And she wasn't even able to testify on her own behalf because the woman was thought to be incompetent to be able to do that. So she was assessed a fine, and she clearly stated that, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, and she would not at all pay 1 cent of the fine. That made the all-male Supreme Court have to deal with this issue that she raised. So they ruled that while the United States Constitution does recognize women as citizens, only the individual states could grant them the right to vote. And so over the next several decades, suffragists mobilized to take their cause to the individual states. Now, at this point, I'd like to clarify terms because you hear me calling them suffragists. Suffragists, you also hear the term suffragette, but we cannot use suffragette when we are referring to the American women's rights advocates here, because the term suffragette was made up in 1906 by a London journalist who was making fun of the militant suffragists in the UK. He used the diminutive "et" basically to belittle them. And so these women in the UK said, okay, so you're going to call us suffragettes? We're going to call ourselves suffragettes. And they took ownership of the term. And so they began using that term. In the United States, that did not happen. Women continued to be called suffragists.
That's so interesting. I don't think I knew the history about the word suffragette. So never going to use it the same way again, with a little bit more meaning. Thank you so much. So who were the aunties then? And why would somebody or a group of people not want women to vote?
And that seems rather odd to us, right? Okay. Not all women saw suffrage as a goal to which they should aspire. Upper middle class society women were focused on women's private sphere. And there was this sense of moral purity and superiority coming from their domestic roles. And they saw the male world of politics as something that was corrupt, and should they vote, that they would become corrupted themselves. And so they preferred to hold on to their coveted role of angel of the house. And they formally organized in 1911, not only in this country, but in the UK as well. In 1911, they formed the National Association opposed to women's suffrage, or the Antis, as they were known.
Oh, so interesting. Thank you again for that. Did the call then to include women in the vote, votes for women, did that include all women though?
Well, Stanton and Anthony were so single-minded in their goal that they were prepared to abandon their Black sisters to get the support of white Southern men and women as well. So the elite, educated, middle-class Black women maintained that for them, it was really a matter of life and death. If they didn't get some political clout, they would continue to suffer horrible discrimination. And comes to mind people like Mary Church Terrell and Ida Wells Barnett, who were articulate promoters of African American women's suffrage. Terrell made the point, she passionately argued, that Black women were victimized on two counts, by their race and by their sex. And thus, for Black women, the vote was critical.
That makes great sense. It's so interesting, all the different tensions, because Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist, of course, was a huge supporter of women's rights, wasn't he?
Oh, yes. And he backed Katie Stanton's resolution on suffrage. He was one of the few men that attended the Seneca Falls Convention. They were great friends, but they, parted on this issue.
Yeah, it's interesting, all the different fault lines when an issue heats up like that. So how did women finally win the right to vote in 1920 in the United States?
So comes the second wave then. By the early 20th century, Stanton and Anthony were dead. The old movement had seen its course. The torch was passed to women like Carrie Chapman Catt, who headed the National Association twice. And Catt used to say that I don't care what it is, you want to call it a right, a privilege, or a duty, but whatever it is, the women want it. So she was very, very vociferous in her reviews, but she came to be challenged. The National came to be challenged by young, fiery women's rights advocates, like Alice Paul, a New Jersey Quaker that I'm not sure a lot of people know about. But she was someone who had been radicalized by the English suffragettes. She had spent time in England. She got to know the Pankhursts, Emmeline and her daughter, Christabel Pankhurst, who were militant suffragists, or so it was thought. They formed the Women's Social and Political Union, and their philosophy was it is deeds that count and not words. They basically promoted acts of civil disobedience among their groups. And when she came back, when Paul came back to the United States, she really thought that the National was dragging its heels. It wasn't aggressive enough. So she broke with the National and she formed her own party in 1913 called the National Woman's Party. She was very single-minded that nothing was going to take her away from the idea of the vote. And in 1913, to draw attention to themselves, she organized a parade in Washington on the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. And her marchers were in the streets. The crowd became very hostile. Someone yelled out, "Go home to your mother." And he was met with the response, "My mother is here." So they were extremely single-minded in their cause, to the point that when the war broke out and everybody was supposed to be patriotic, well, they said, "We're patriotic, but we're still going forward with our demand for women's rights." And they picketed the White House. Wilson was about up to here with these women. The Nationalists distanced themselves from them, saying that their radicalism was going to destroy the whole movement. And these women picketed in front of the White House. They were called the Silent Sentinels because they stood there with their signs, votes for women. A lot of people said, "This is treasonous. We have a war on here. You don't picket against the government." 168 of them were dragged away, brutalized in jail. Alice Paul was put in solitary confinement. She went on a hunger strike. She was force-fed. This happened again very much in England. There were 30 of her colleagues did the same thing. They were nicknamed the Iron-Jawed Angels, which explains the title of the film that we're going to be showing on the 18th of March here. And so finally, Congress passes the amendment in June of 1919, but in order to become law, 36 legislatures out of 48 states had to ratify the amendment. And by the spring of 1920, 35 states had signed on. The focus then turned to Nashville, Tennessee for ratification, and the antis were busy at work. The liquor and manufacturing lobbies were bribing legislators, thinking that women's votes were going to be bad for their business. There's a whole story behind that as well. Mm-hmm. Then it came to the critical day, August 18th, when the youngest member of the state legislature, Harry Thomas Byrne, everybody thought he was going to vote no. He voted yes. He had changed his mind. What had happened was his mother had written to him the last minute and she said, "Harry, be a good boy. If it comes down to your vote, do the right thing." And so that was it. Everybody was horrified except for the women, who were like flabbergasted. They were so excited that they won. Interesting to note, that was the 18th of August. The amendment did not become law for another week until the 26th of August, because the antis did not give up. They accused Byrne of accepting bribes, and then they proceeded to try to bribe legislators themselves to try to, change their votes. They even took it to the Supreme Court, which dismissed the case. It was basically a done deal. What I wanted to say, though, and this, we think the story ends there, but the women's struggle did not end with the passage of the 19th Amendment, because there were scores of women in the United States, including Native Americans and Chinese immigrants, that were not extended the right of suffrage, and many more, particularly African Americans, for whom it was extremely difficult because of the stifling Jim Crow regulations that were in place throughout the South. The federal voting Rights Act, which became law in 1965, would address this, would guarantee the franchise to African American women. But let me just end here by saying the challenges persist to this day, but we do have the right to vote.
Wonderful. Lorraine, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome.